For the Fallout New Vegas game, I'm going to do something a little different than the Fallout 3 one. Because there is substantially more political content in New Vegas, I'm going to break it down into 3 videos about 1 hour each. The first will be on the New California Republic, the second will be on Caesar's Legion, and the third will be the general story itself and some of the remaining factions. The purpose of these videos is to make learning Marxist theory easier. Like the movie Jarhead, where the Jamie Foxx character says to take what you already know and apply it to what you are learning, makes it easier to understand. This is what I'm doing with these videos. Enjoy. Fallout New Vegas is a role-playing game developed by Obsidian Entertainment and published by Bethesda Softworks. While New Vegas is not a direct sequel, it uses the same game engine and style as Fallout 3. It was developed by a few of the employees who worked on the previous Fallout games at Black Isle Studios, along with a larger number of new employees. It is set primarily in a post-apocalyptic Nevada, although some of the areas of California and Arizona are also visited. The game was released on October 19, 2010 in North America, October 22nd in Europe, and November 4 in Asia. It is available on PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. The game is set in and around a post-apocalyptic retro-futuristic Las Vegas following the Great War between the US and China as a conventional and nuclear war that occurred on the 22nd and 23rd of October 2077. And it lasted for about 2 hours, while causing immense damage and destruction. Before the Great War was the Resource Wars, during which the United Nations disbanded, a plague rendered the United States paranoid, and Canada was annexed. The city of Las Vegas itself wasn't hit as hard as most of the other districts, with most buildings being left intact as a result. The Hoover Dam supplies free electricity and water to those who control it. The story has taken some parts from the Fallout and Fallout 2 stories, and this is for the most part unrelated to its predecessor, Fallout 3. Fallout New Vegas takes place in 2281, 4 years after the events of Fallout 3, 39 years after Fallout 2, and 120 years after Fallout. The New California Republic plays a major part in the game's story, being in a 3-way struggle amongst the Caesar's Legion slavers and the mysterious Mr. House. The courier, the player's character, was meant to deliver a package from Prim to New Vegas. However, he or she is intercepted by the Great Khans, led by a mysterious man who shoots him or her and takes the package, leaving the courier dead in a shallow grave. The courier is later found by a robot named Victor and is taken to the settlement of Good Springs, where Dr. Mitchell saves his or her life, and the courier is given some medical tests. The player is pushed back into the open world, and the quest, Ain't That a Kick in the Head, begins. New California, officially the New California Republic, often abbreviated NCR, is a fairly large democratic federation based in California, with holdings in Nevada, Oregon, Mexico, aka Baja, and along the Colorado River. The NCR emphasizes and claims to support a myriad of old world values, such as democracy, personal liberty, and the rule of law. It also strives to restore the general order of the wasteland, the improvement and development of infrastructure and economic systems, and a basic common peace between people. Though appearing to be a benevolent entity of governance, the ability to control the land it claims to protect, the fidelity of those who live under their rule, and the widespread corruption within their political system has been questioned by many without clear response by the NCR themselves. The New California Republic was born from the remnants of the survivors of Vault 15 and the small walled community they founded, Shady Sands. Under the leadership of Aradesh, and with the assistance of the Vault Dweller, who saved Tandy, Aradesh's daughter, and future president of the NCR, the community prospered. Trade routes with other settlements allowed cultural exchange, and a movement to form a national identity gradually took root and won popular acceptance. In 2186, the town of Shady Sands changed its name to the New California Republic and formed a trial council government to draft a constitution. 4 more settlements joined the council, and in 2189 the NCR was voted into existence as a sprawling federation of 5 states: Shady Sands, Los Angeles, Axon, the Hub, and Dayglow. By post-apocalyptic standards, the NCR is a paragon of economic success and good ethical character, political enfranchisement, rule of law, a reasonable degree of physical security, and a standard of living better than mere subsistence are daily realities for 700,000 plus citizens. Currently, the NCR is in a state of transition, with rapid economic growth and a sea of change in political leadership, endangering its grand humanitarian ideals. Nowhere is this more evident than the Mojave, where the occupation of Hoover Dam has improved access to electricity and water, but at the cost of straining its budget and embroiling its armed forces in a morally corrosive imperialist project. The NCR's government's aim is to annex New Vegas as the Republic's newest state. While it already controls Hoover Dam, its treaty with Mr. House and the Three Families compels it to allot 5% of the dam's electrical and water production to locals, use free of charge. Adding insult to injury, the NCR is locked into protecting New Vegas from invasion by Caesar's Legion, even as it receives not one cap in tax revenue from the Strip's highly lucrative resort operations. NCR citizens in the Mojave have largely come there for economic reasons, whether as paid citizen soldiers or as prospectors and fortune seekers. The NCR is by many measures pretty close to being a modern-day republic. They have a relatively traditional American political structure holding elections on a regular basis. It has differences due to economic structure. The base, as opposed to the superstructure, has a greater variety than we see in the United States today. Most of the political and economic is centered on the core region, where the wealthiest of citizens reside. This is where many of the powerful elite can be found, and its base of political maneuvering, as the brokers of power concentrate their wealth there. Outside the main city lives the majority of the NCR population. Many of them are just regular people or settlers who wander into the realm of the NCR looking for protection. Economically, these fringes are made up of mercantile traders and small farmers. These people economically interact with the NCR by paying taxes. In return, they receive protection from the various threats of the post-apocalyptic world. These people are considered to be citizens. Usually the most efficient means by which to gain this protection is to have a settlement or small community become part of the NCR itself. However, it should be held as questionable how many of these settlements have voluntarily done so. There appears to be a history of some being forced into the NCR against their will. As I said, the government is relatively patterned off of the pre-war United States government. Like today, it is divided into three branches of legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative branch is the Congress, staffed by representatives elected by their states and senators, forming two houses, House of Representatives and the Senate. The congressmen use a variety of titles: counselor, councilman, representative, or senator. In particular, the hub, in its own obstinate way, prefers to call their representative governors. The executive branch is the Republican Council headed by the president and the vice president. The president and vice president are elected by NCR citizens, with advice from the Congress. Last, the judicial branch comprises the courts and judges, ruling in accordance with the NCR's adapted version of American common law. Life can vary depending on where you live within the NCR. In the city limits, there are strict regulations on weapons possession, prostitution, slavery, and gambling. They are not permitted where the authority on the NCR are the strongest. Once outside the city limits, the rules change, as does the culture to a degree. Life in the Mojave wasteland is different due to the mostly absent policing and military presence. The laws are much more flexible, even some removed. I see this as being for two primary reasons: to accommodate the more less developed and fragile economics of the countryside, and the lack of an ability to effectively enforce it. It would seem as though they lack the manpower to keep everyone in line to the degree that they wish to. The NCR is unique in its economic makeup. It has large agrarian interests next to small commodity farmers. It has a significant wealthy mercantile class who gain power from their riches from commercial exchanges. In other areas, criminal organizations hold economic power. Each of these groups exerts some influence over the society and its political structure. In theory, this is a sound and well-balanced system, but in practice, every state tries to assert its independence and work towards furthering its own agenda. There's a great amount of friction between the states of Hub and Shady Sands, usually related to the trade rights and caravan routes, while New Reno remains dominated by various criminal interests. Significant pressure is exerted upon the political and economic direction of the NCR by a variety of private interests. In particular, the Brahmin barons, whose wealth gives them great influence at the ballot box and whose needs are often placed first by officials seeking support in their political ambitions. With the armed forces, the gun runners gain special dispensation and influence as they are the primary contributor to the NCR's weapon arsenal. Elsewhere, monopolies like the Crimson Caravan and similar trading families dominate the trade routes and their use of their wealth to gain influence with the NCR government and extort large amounts of money. Smaller competitors who are unable to compete with both the larger competition as well as the high taxes are inevitably muscled out. This is not totally unlike our modern capitalist system where competing interests among the capitalist class appear alongside each other grasping for their interests. For example, in America today, we saw the furious debate over the Obamacare proposal. One section of the capitalist class, the medical supply manufacturers, insurance companies, privately held medical institutions, and financial firms who invest in the medical field. The guarantee of people receiving healthcare through state funding means that previously listed people will be getting a lot more money for services, meaning they will have a tremendous profit motive in influencing the government to go forward with the program. On the other side of the issue were all the commercial and industrial interests that would end up paying a little more out in business costs to afford the changes. It is in their profit motive interest to influence the government not to push it through. The NCR is not much different in this respect. They, too, have competing moneyed interests. What is economically good for one group is not necessarily good for another. Contradictions in the NCR are also manifested between the city and the countryside. The people in the countryside produce the agriculture and livestock that the city people enjoy. Meanwhile, they receive much less of the social product and the benefits of the abstract labor due to their distance from the political core. This leads to differing living standards, particularly in the realm of electricity, access to medical and governmental services, as well as police and military protection. As it says in the game, a lot of power is invested in particular individuals in the cities back west. Citizens of the frontier regions often feel like they are not listened to and are forgotten about. Many have the opinion that they produce for the cities that ignore them. They pay taxes to those same cities and receive little benefit in return for them. What is this contradiction, and where does it come from? This antagonistic contradiction appears in any class antagonistic socioeconomic formation. It makes itself manifest in its particular level of economic development, that being the productive forces, education, science, and culture. The separation of the city and the countryside first appeared when the productive forces developed to a point where a serious division of labor came into existence. The new degree of the division of labor separated some of the social labor from others. A portion of it became centralized in the cities. As capital required a centralization of labor for production, it drew a portion of the people away from farming and agriculture into what was the beginnings of the industrial sector. The antagonistic relationship between the countryside and the city manifests itself differently given the level of socioeconomic development. However, the opposition between the city and the countryside is always an opposition between the ruling classes of the city and the working people of the countryside, between the ruling classes of the city and the countryside, and between the ruling classes of the countryside and the working people of the city. The city has always been oppressive towards the countryside. The former exploits the latter in their relationship of the production of the social product. This has always taken place in history via monopoly prices, as Marx described. The town exploits the land economically with its system of taxation, its guild organization, its direct commercial fraudulence, and its usury. Although the countryside at that time exploits the town politically, wherever feudalism has not been broken down by exceptional urban development, as in Italy. This antagonism reaches its highest development with capitalism when the oppression of the countryside becomes total, encompassing the economy, politics, and culture. Capitalist relations appear in the countryside under the influence of the cities. The process of urbanization drives people off their land into the cities to look for work. The population of the city grows, increasing with power, while the population of the countryside shrinks, losing power. It is in the nature of capitalist production to continually reduce the agricultural populations as compared with the non-agricultural population, because in industry, the increase of constant capital at the expense of variable capital goes hand in hand with an absolute increase in variable capital despite its relative decrease. On the other hand, in agriculture, the variable capital required for the exploitation of a certain plot of land decreases absolutely. It thus can only increase to the extent that new land is taken into cultivation. But this again requires a prerequisite, a still greater growth of the non-agrarian population. In the development of cities, there is a concentration of wealth, education, and culture that engenders a backwardness and poverty in the countryside. This creates a further divide of mental and manual labor between these two. This was laid out by Karl Marx in the German ideology. The greatest division of material and mental labor is the separation of town and country. The antagonism between town and country begins with the transition from barbarism to civilization, from tribe to state, from locality to nation. It runs through the whole history of civilization to the present day. The existence of the town implies at the same time the necessity of administration, police, taxes, etc., in short, the municipality, and thus of politics in general. Here first began to manifest the divisions of the population into two great classes, which is directly based on the division of labor and on the instruments of production. The town already is in actual fact the concentration of the population, of instruments of production, of capital, of pleasures, of needs, while the country demonstrates just the opposite fact, isolation and separation. The antagonism between town and country can only exist within the framework of private property. It is the most crass expression of the subjugation of the individual under the division of labor, under a definite activity forced upon him, a subjugation which makes one man into a restricted town animal, the other into a restricted country animal, and daily creates anew the conflict between their interests. Labor is here again the chief thing, power over individuals, and as long as the latter exists, private property must exist. The abolition of the antagonism between town and country is one of the first conditions of communal life, a condition which again deepens on a mass of material premises, and which cannot be fulfilled by the mere will, as anyone who can see at the first glance. The separation of town and country can also be understood as the separation of capital and landed property, as the beginning of the existence and development of capital independent of landed property, the beginning of property having its basis only in labor and exchange. Because of this very real oppression, Lenin was the first to recognize the importance of the peasantry in the development of revolution. He made it quite clear that the revolution needed peasants if they were to be successful. With that, he said it required the development of their social consciousness because they themselves were force. I see a kind of similarity with Mao Zedong here. Mao called the peasant movements a wave, and they had to be at the fore, leading it. Trotskyists try to project their racist and prejudiced views onto Lenin by claiming he said they were reactionary, referring to his description of the middle peasant, and Verkhovzha makes a similar error when he falsely claims that Mao let the peasants run the Chinese Revolution. Both Trotsky and Hoxha are incorrect and bastardize the words of these leaders, who understood the peasants. This is why the Bolsheviks used the phrase peace, land, and bread. It was intended to include everyone. Those who were anti-war, the peasants who wanted land, and those who were suffering from the Tsar's starvation and oppression. Lenin made it perfectly clear that we are to support the peasantry. The peasantry wants land and freedom. There can be no two opinions about this score. All class-conscious workers support the revolutionary peasantry with all their might. All class-conscious workers want and are fighting for the peasantry to receive all of the land in full freedom. All of the land means not putting up with any partial concessions and handouts. It means reckoning, not on a compromise between the peasantry and the landlords, but the abolition of landed estates. And the party of the class-conscious proletariat, the Social Democrats, have most vigorously proclaimed this view at its third Congress held last May. The RSDLP adopted a resolution directly declaring for support of the peasants' revolutionary demands, including confiscation of all privately owned estates. This resolution clearly shows that the party of the class-conscious workers supports the peasants' demand for all the land. And in this respect, the content of the resolution adopted at the conference of the other half of our party fully coincides with that of the resolution passed by the Third Congress of the RSDLP. For the NCR, there is no desire to end the antagonistic contradiction. Capitalism, which we may say there is to a small degree in the NCR, does not resolve, but perpetuates such divides. It is a system of class standing in opposition to each other with only their own interests at heart. Mao understood this and saw the peasantry of China as a much more complex and nuanced than Lenin saw it. China was different, as much more rural than Russia was. Up to 85% of China's population were peasants with varying relationships to the means of production and the degrees of oppression and exploitation. Wang Ming, who led the party before Mao, insisted that the industrial workers must be the vanguard of the people to fight for liberation. This reduced the possibilities of action down to 10% of the population. This endeavor obviously failed because there was no significant revolutionary base. They failed at their attempt and were nearly wiped out militarily. It was Mao who argued that they take what must become the Long March in order to save them. 6,000-mile journey later, they resettled in the countryside, and Mao began his investigation into the conditions of the peasants in the countryside. He took over as leader of the party and reoriented the revolution to guiding the peasantry. Mao had analyzed the concrete conditions in China on the basis of Marxism-Leninism, and also the fundamental thesis of Lenin and Stalin on the Chinese Revolution, and had determined that while the revolution had been set back, various circumstances existed that allowed the establishment of rural base areas surrounded by the enemy in different parts of China. Closely connected to this was the question of the peasants, who Mao correctly stated had to be the main, not leading force in the revolution during the democratic stage. Central to the building up of these base areas was mobilizing the peasantry under the leadership of the Communist Party and carrying out the agrarian revolution. Wang Ming barely opposed Mao on these basic theses, as well as on numerous political and military questions that flowed from them. Like Hoja, Wang Ming railed against Mao's thesis that in China the cities must be encircled by the countryside. Like Hoja, Wang could not understand the ebbs and flows of the revolution, and instead presented a picture of a constantly favorable objective situation, with only the subjective factor being necessary to lead an immediate successful onslaught on reactionary power. Wang Ming led the party in a wrong military, political, and ideological line that led to defeat by Chiang Kai-shek in his fifth encirclement and suppression campaign, a defeat which forced the Red Army to retreat in the famous Long March. As a result of this left opportunist line, large numbers of the Communist Party and Revolutionary Army, as well as base areas, were wiped out. Mao by no means allowed the peasantry to lead the revolution. He said they were a force for change, and they wanted to be in leadership. There are three alternatives: to march at their head and lead them, to trail behind them, gesticulating and criticizing, or to stand in their way and oppose them. Every Chinese is free to choose, but events will force you to make that choice quickly. There was also sharecropping. It's a system of agriculture in which the landowner allows the tenant to use the land in return for his share of the crops produced on the land. Sharecropping has a long history, and there are a wide range of different situations and types of agreements that have used a form of the system. Some are governed by tradition, others by law. Legal contract systems such as the Meziandria or the Islamic system of Muqassad occur widely. These sharecroppers of the NCR have a unique position as well. They are like transitive proletarians. They're not truly proletarian because of their temporary status, and more like settlers because they're working towards being able to own land there. They are the NCR citizens brought into the farming that needs to be done to support the occupation and military campaign. They aren't really commodity producers because they have no right to what they produce, rather a wage that keeps them alive while they are there. A good comparison could be made to Australians. They arrived as prisoners but could work the land or mines until they were able to homestead. Of course, the NCR sees none of this. Since they are at least a pseudo-capitalist state, they have no ability to see the antagonistic contradiction that may lead them to their own downfall. This is the one edge Caesar's legion has over the NCR. Their society, minus the slavery, has little in the way of divide and contradictions among various groups because, again, outside of slaveholding, they don't exist. However, they still do have their contradictions with outside forces in the greater society, many of which manifest themselves more antagonistically than they do with the NCR, due to their brutal and violent nature. This war is like all war. It is essentially political in nature. As the imperialists struggle for power, the bourgeois struggle for profit and influence in it. The people are essentially left behind and ignored. Only those who can exert and influence matter. If you're not a trader, farmer, you're pretty alienated. This is why we see the most dissatisfied with the NCR are regular people. The NCR was born out of the survivors of Vault 15, which means they were all raised on American exceptionalism. I think this is a fair assumption given that America was in a state of war when they went into the vaults. When they came out of the vaults, their desire was to form a new society based on many of their now old world values. For example, bourgeois democracy, personal liberty, the rule of law. In many people's eyes, in its current manifestation, it takes the form of jingoism, or nationalism, that takes the form of militant foreign policy. We can see a great deal of patriotism in the NCR's operations and appearance, and not just because we mostly encounter the military in the game. NCR flags are predominantly displayed, and people talk about allegiance to the Republic. From this, I am not surprised that their actions mirror that of colonial America. These people, or at least those in power, seek new territory, so they go out and take it. This is the logic and necessity of almost all nations. This is particularly so when the basis is American exceptionalism mentality. As the Republic grew, so did the needs of its society. This is only logical. The greater your population, the greater your need for resources are. The problem is that in the free and fair exchange, you can't always get what you want or need, thus those in power have a choice. They can either accept the eventual destabilization and failure, or they can take what they need by force. In history, this has manifested itself in imperialism and colonialism. It is the forceful taking of resources and land for one's personal or societal benefit. The great comparison there is for the NCR settler colonial United States. The NCR's move into New Vegas matches many parallels with the British colonists and pilgrims moving into the so-called New World. Upon arrival, the NCR finds that there are various tribes living on the land they want. Some of these are the great Khans, the Kings, the Jackals and Muertas, Boomers, White Glove Society, and Vipers. Like colonial America, the NCR undertook a slow campaign of genocide against these tribes. Each tribe was forced off their land, relocating to much harsher territory, taking on many hardships. The tribes attempted to resist the NCR, but lacked the technological capability and professional training the NCR settlers had. While many battles were fierce, the tribes never really stood a chance in victory in the end. The NCR had great resources to draw upon given the size of their empire stretching back to California. The tribes ended up like Native Americans today, living on very small patches of land like reserves, except the NCR victims have no legal standing, and know the NCR will be back to finish the jobs. A great metaphor that appears in the game is the desperate last stand of the Khans before they were weakened beyond recovery. In the past century, Bitter Springs was used by the Khans as a semi-permanent community. Due to prolonged conflict with the NCR, the great Khans were eventually tracked back to Bitter Springs by the NCR forces. The assault that had rapidly followed was known as the Bitter Springs Massacre due to the NCR's first recon mistakenly shooting down dozens of young, old, and wounded Khans who attempted to escape through a southern slot canyon from a location called Coyote Tail Ridge. Today, Bitter Springs hosts a refugee from settlements of Kaiser's Legion are raising, a situation that is becoming increasingly untenable. The metaphor is for Wounded Knee. The Wounded Knee Massacre occurred on December 29, 1890, near Wounded Knee Creek, on the Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in the U.S. state of South Dakota. On the day before, a detachment of the U.S. 7th Cavalry Regiment, commanded by Major Samuel M. Whitside, intercepted Spotted Elk's bands of Miniconjou Lakota and 38 Hunkpapa Lakota near Porcupine Butte, and escorted them 5 miles westward, 8 kilometers to Wounded Knee Creek, where they made camp. The remainder of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, led by Colonel James W. Forsyth, and surrounded the encampment, supported by 4 Hotchkiss guns. On the morning of December 29, the troops went into the camp to disarm the Lakota. One version of the events claims that during the process of disarming the Lakota, a deaf tribesman named Black Coyote was reluctant to give up his rifle, claiming he had paid a lot for it. A scuffle over Black Coyote's rifle escalated and a shot was fired, which resulted in the 7th Cavalry's opening fire indiscriminately from all sides, killing men, women, and children, as well as some of their own fellow soldiers. Lakota warriors still had weapons, began shooting back at the attackers, who quickly suppressed the Lakota fire. The surviving Lakota fled, and U.S. cavalrymen pursued and killed many who were unarmed. By the time it was over, at least 150 men, women, and children of the Lakota had been killed. 51 were wounded, 4 men, 47 women and children, some of whom died later. Some estimates placed the number of dead at 300. 25 soldiers also died, and 39 were wounded. 6 of the wounded would later die. At least 20 soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor. Of course, in reality, this was a one-sided slaughter, a slaughter that was probably going to take place anyway, regardless of whether or not they had given up their guns. The tribals of the Mojave had all been treated poorly by the NCR in their quest to conquer all territory. Some tribes have managed to avoid some devastation by holding up inside New Vegas Strip. The Kings have managed to scrape by. Others, like the White Gloves, have made a fairly good living for themselves in casino gambling. We see another parallel here. The largest source of revenue for many Native American nations is also casino gambling. The NCR has absorbed these tribals willing to integrate into the new society to a degree. They still remain outside of it as a part of the three families. And it has massacred those who have refused. This has been the United States government's policy towards Native American. The NCR and the United States both have a colonizer mentality. They believe that they have some sort of right to just take the land and resources of people and force them off their land. There are all kinds of justifications for this: religion, manifest destiny, perceived superiority, white man's burden. Whatever the pretext, it has always been about trade, money, and resources. Marx lays it out so well in Capital, Volume 1. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the repatriation, enslavement, and the entombment in the minds of indigenous populations of that continent, the beginnings of conquest and plunder of India, and the conversion of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of blackskins, are all things which characterize the dawn of the era of capitalist production. This has always remained true. The nature of colonialism is profit-making. It is the theft of resources and land, nowadays even labor power, with the goal of trading and production in mind. It is the expansion of capital beyond the borders of one country, needing the benefits of another. If this is not handed over peacefully, it can be taken by force. Of course, the economic relations of the colonized and the at home in the colonizer are different. At home in the mother country, the smug deceitfulness of the political economist can turn his relation of absolute dependence between the capitalist and the worker into a free contract between buyer and seller. But in the colonies, this beautiful illusion is torn aside. The colonized people are under a very direct and open exploitation, not hidden behind a system of exchange like it is in the society of the colonizer. The colonized people can look forward to being beaten and whipped if they don't show up for a job they probably never consented to. They may even face a local government under the control of the colonizer to carry out such actions. The indigenous can expect their land to be stolen from them in a very direct way. In modern times, a lack of ability to compete with the global market is what forces peasants off their land. They then flood into the cities looking for work. A good question to ask next is, why does capital in our day and age need to do this? Is it simple greed, or is there an aspect of capitalism that forces them to do so? It is a matter of fact that capitalism needs to constantly expand. Even pre-capitalist colonial times needed to expand, although it did work differently economically. A prime example of a way to explain this is by looking at the industrial or business cycle and how it functions. For brevity, we'll assume that an economy is chugging along at full speed and is about to hit the wall where it goes into recession. All of the greatness of capitalism has reached its limit. The economy has expanded to its maximum and there is nowhere to go but down. The banks, financial institutions, and government are aware of what is taking place and have been for some time. At this moment, they're planning the best way to ride out the crash that is about to begin, and probably already has. Recessions are different all the time, and they vary in intensity and the speed in which they occur. Regardless, it has begun, and the elite are scrambling to keep their heads above water. The working and middle class, for the most part, are blissfully unaware that tens of millions of them are about to be thrown out of work. In the U.S., it is traditional for the crisis to begin in the housing construction sector. Most obviously, it begins when credit for housing construction begins to contract. It becomes increasingly difficult to get mortgages. The building of houses slows, and soon this spreads to areas like automobiles and other sectors of industrial production. Buying a house usually involves buying a ton of other commodities along with it. Home ownership, being such a cultural value in the United States, demonstrates its power by being able to affect so many other commodity sectors. As the production of these commodities slows, the demand for Department 1 commodities which produce them begin to slide. Auto manufacturing has a great reliance on Department 1 products, given how automated the industry is. With reduced production comes a reduced number of laborers as unemployment begins to rise, albeit slowly. A key point here to remember is that overproduction is beginning. This overproduction cannot occur on a large, crisis-prone scale unless large credit expansion allows it to. There is an overtrading that is taking place that is possible because of this credit. This expansion has reached its limit and is threatening to pop and fall right back in line with the actual token and metallic money in existence. Credit is becoming increasingly harder to come by, and this does not go unnoticed. At some point, credit stops. It contracts. Now all those sales that were taking place because of credit alone suddenly dry up, leaving demand in a sudden dead stop. Consumer commodities begin piling up in warehouses and store shelves. Unfortunately, the bourgeois still think there is hope for the economy. Capital spending is still high and companies are announcing that they are intending to make such investments in the near future. If things are about to go bad, why would this be taking place? Or sometimes they think that this spending would be enough to avoid crisis altogether. Despite how they feel, capital has proven to be a lagging indicator. Just because someone says they have a plan to expand or upgrade production doesn't mean that recession isn't about to take place or avoid it. Bourgeois economics in this regard is very odd. When capitalists are trying to figure out how the future looks, they look at each other capitalists and what they're doing. If they're being positive, they become positive as well. Everybody assumes that everybody else knows what they're doing. The increase in capital spending can actually have the opposite of its intended effect. It creates more excess capacity. With the decrease in sales, excess commodity production capacity begins to appear. First, it will arrive in Department 2 goods, particularly in luxuries, as they're the first commodities people cease to purchase. The lack of demand has a domino-like effect that spreads to Department 1 goods. These can be held off because they're not necessities like Department 2 goods are. Some of the Department 2 goods. Further production of Department 1 goods can be put off until profitability in their production returns. The extent of the excess productive capacity is determined by how long and how bad the crisis gets. If it is a major depression, there will be a tremendous amount of excess productive capacity. The degree to which the economy shrinks can give us some kind of an idea as to how much there is. A slowdown in the economy is very different from the Great Depression, as it is from the 2001 crisis of the dot-com bubble. The stage is now set for the crisis to start going full gear. Reduction of the luxury end of Department 2 goods and some of the Department 1 goods now begin to spread. The snowball effect of falling profitability and unemployment start the vicious cycle. Now consumer spending has dropped considerably due to a freeze in credit and a loss of worker wages. Department 1 commodity production begins to suffer in full as entire industries are failing. Once again, we are at the point where the entire economy is in crisis. Even industry is in jeopardy. Except, of course, the gold producer, who, as we saw previously, is now increasing his production. The bourgeois economists have now been proven wrong. They believe that capital spending is a sign of economic health. As long as reinvestment or new investment remains strong, there is no problem and recession is averted. The worst for this are Keynesians, who actually believe that low capital spending is what causes crisis. If the capital spending stays strong, then there is no recession apparently. Of course, this is proven not to be true. The very fact that the economy has become increasingly reliant on credit money to keep up demand for commodities instead of token money shows to be fallacious. If it were not the case, then effective demand wouldn't require consumer credit. If people could afford these commodities, then they wouldn't be ringing up so much debt on their credit cards and other loans. The production of commodities has already exceeded the ability of consumers to purchase them. This continued consumption using credit gives the false impression of prosperity. Marx called this fictitious prosperity. Keynesians denying this is just simply ridiculous. A very obvious observation would be that you couldn't overproduce something if you didn't have an excess ability to produce it. Any trick that keeps up demand beyond the actual ability of consumers to consume and any investment of capital in the ability to produce it inevitably causes overproduction to exacerbate. The closer to the peak of the boom the cycle gets, the fiercer the competition for shrinking credit becomes. All businesses, governments, consumers, etc. are trying to get a hold of it. The more industrial capitalists monopolize the remaining credit to finance capital spending, the less there will be for consumers who actually purchase said commodities. There are more problems caused by competition and contraction of the credit supply. The government too is affected by it. When it borrows money, it will be getting it at a higher rate of interest. It will make servicing the debt more expensive. During this time, a government is more likely to borrow money, as well as, given their power in the economy, they make the supply of credit even tighter. What capitalism needs here is space to expand even more, but the economy has physical limits as well as economic ones. Cheaper and cheaper resources must be captured in order to suppress the falling rate of profit and to keep ahead of the competition by making production cheaper. Here, it is good to turn to Lenin. Imperialism emerged as the development and direct continuation of the fundamental characteristics of capitalism in general. But capitalism only became capitalist imperialism at a definite and very high stage of its development, when certain of its fundamental characteristics began to change into their opposites, when the features of the epoch of transition from capitalism to a higher social and economic system had taken shape and revealed themselves in all spheres. Economically, the main thing in this process is the displacement of capitalist free competition by capitalist monopoly. Free competition is the basic feature of capitalism and of commodity production generally. Monopoly is the exact opposite of free competition, but we have seen the latter being transformed into monopoly before our eyes, creating large-scale industry and forcing out small industry, replacing large-scale by still larger-scale industry, and carrying concentration of production and capital to the point where out of it has grown and is growing monopoly, cartels, syndicates, and trusts, and merging with them the capital of a dozen or so banks which manipulate thousands of millions. At the time, the monopolies which have grown out of free competition do not eliminate the latter, but exist above it and alongside it, and thereby give rise to a number of very accurate, intense antagonism, frictions, and conflicts. Monopoly is the transition from capitalism to a higher system. Of course, we cannot say that the NCR is a true capitalist state, but we can say it is close as anything in the Fallout universe. Thus, we don't see a full-on Lenin-type imperialism, but this gives you some idea as to why it's happening. There is another reason why the NCR has to expand its sphere of control. One of the scientists, Thomas Hildren, is the Director of Operations of the Office of Science and Industry in the East, living in Camp McCarran, has a warning. In his research, he's come to the conclusion that their current way of life is not sustainable. The low level of agricultural development is fragile and slowly eroding. According to his estimations, the NCR is headed for a famine in about a decade. It's likely that too many resources have been pulled away from development and placed into conquest. It's a contradiction. The NCR must continually expand in order to preserve itself from external enemies gaining power. But at the same time, the war economy use of resources is taking away from those resources that are needed for sustaining themselves. Their constant drive for survival is undermining their ability to survive. We see this phenomenon in capitalism often enough, particularly when the demand for commodities begins to decline. As the demand in commodities lags, the sellers of commodities, usually wholesalers and retailers, increasingly rely on credit themselves to keep out of failure. As the sales for the retailers decreases, the industrial capitalists become endangered. If the commercial capitalists cannot pay their debts to the industrial capitalists, they are both risking bankruptcy. When consumers and businesses go out looking for this short-term credit, the demand for it drives up the interest rates on them. This is indeed a severe warning sign. Now, the financial capitalists are well aware of the impending disaster that is coming. They can see their balance sheets and they know how little people are paying back their debts. They know how far beyond their reserves their credit money is. In this situation, they begin taking huge risks to try to cover those debts. If a big, risky gamble can pay off, it can save them from their mounting, impending huge losses. This is when outrageous speculation begins to really take off. They speculate on everything: stocks, real estate, commodities, and whatever else they can find. All financial institutions are doing this because they're all facing a similar situation. This is how speculation gets out of hand. They do this because they have no choice. The only alternative is to have their financial institution collapse and go under. After the 2008 crisis, people all across America were attacking the banks for making these crazy risks and speculations. It became a major point for talking heads on television and popular rhetoric. Everyone was up in arms over the bankers taking stupid risks that placed the country at risk and caused a gigantic recession. People demanded to know why regulators weren't doing anything. Why were those in charge of watching these people not stopping them from taking those risks? The mistake people make is that these huge gambles are an effect of, not necessarily the cause of, crisis. When faced with looming failure, what were regulators supposed to do? Stop them? This wouldn't have prevented the collapse from happening. It was going to happen anyway. These risks are the financial capitalist attempt to deal with the problem that already existed. The only difference, had they stepped in, it would have been causing the crisis to come sooner. This is why they have to expand. If the NCR is going to keep its people from starving to death, they must gain control of as much arable land as possible to keep up the production of food to meet its citizens' needs. In turn, the drain on resources that the war is causing also hinders the development of land, which would benefit greatly from investment in the mechanization of farming. In essence, the very mechanism of capitalism and its irrational allotment of resources drives the creation and sustainment of the military-industrial complex, which is what the NCR has. Even markets reach their limits when they oversaturate with products. To keep up the cycle of consumption, they must expand the sale of their products into new markets. This is of great benefit to the traders of the NCR, who want, by sheer profit motive, to sell more of their goods. The only way to do that is to start moving your product where it was previously absent. We all know that the traders hold a good deal of influence with the NCR bureaucrats in power. This is especially true since they are a great source of the needed weapons and tax revenue. We should not be surprised that merchants hold such great sway over the government in a semi-capitalist society. The profit motive never changes. The NCR acts very much like the modern-day United States with its imperialism. As I mentioned previously, with its drive for land, the NCR must continually obtain more of it. In their crusade to collect more and more, they end up acting like the U.S. and its imperialist occupations in the Middle East. A huge criticism of the NCR is its lack of concern for the locals and focus entirely on its own citizens. A hidden station was handing out food in Freeside, but it was only for the population of the NCR. This engendered a good deal of distrust and disdain from the locals, who were being occupied and having their needs ignored by the occupiers. The NCR walks in, takes the area's resources, and then excludes the local population from them. Many people have become hostile towards the NCR, like the tribe, the Kings. This is entirely to be expected when the NCR occupies their territory and excludes them from it. This is described by the character Rotface.
People in Freeside generally fall into one of two categories. Those who've been here all their lives call themselves locals. When people from the NCR and other places started pouring in, the locals began referring to them as squatters, and the name stuck. The locals blame the squatters for the scarcity of resources in Freeside, and the squatters blame any act of violence against them on the locals. They're both right to some extent, and violent outbreaks between the two are all too common these days.
Is this not like the U.S. occupation of Iraq? When the U.S. military rolled into Iraq, they had the shoot anything that moves mentality that has led to over 1.5 million deaths in the end. The country was taken by force against the will of the people who did not want to be occupied. Many of those people were stuck by their local dictator, Saddam Hussein, in defense of their nation because they saw the coming occupiers as worse than what they had. This was also seen in the very limited defense Freeside put up. The result was the local groups being pushed to the side while the occupiers took over their land. Did we not see the same thing in Iraq? The U.S. military took over, and the Sunni, Shiite, and Kurdish groups got pushed out of authority, marginalized from power, just like the Kings and the Van Graffs. The result of the invasion was a complete destabilization of the area, a destruction of what social order there was. People clung to the tribes they came from and adhered more greatly along those lines. The outbreak of violence between the Van Graffs and the Kings can be seen much like the U.S. destruction of the largely secular Hussein government. Religious tension and violence was kept to a minimum until the toppling of the government. Then, the old hostilities that were suppressed for the most part broke out and caused further violence. Locals in Freeside take exception to the unjust power brutally wielded by the NCR, and it led to instances of violence between the occupiers and the locals. The same appeared in Iraq, when the U.S. troops were not welcomed, but in fact despised. The U.S. soldiers brutally suppressed the population for their interests of imperialism, leading to mass killings of people whose only crime was not wanting to be occupied. This sentiment is expressed in the King's statement of return to sender when they referred to the colonizers of the NCR showing up in their territory. The resources of the locals were taken to be used for the benefit of the NCR and its imperialist conquest, not the people who lived there. Agricultural land was taken to be used for the profits and sustainment of the empire, and not the people of the region. What funds flow into the area from the NCR go into the defense of their soldiers and the protection of the resources they want. The people they occupy, however, are left in squalor, which the NCR contributed to a large extent. This is very much like the U.S. occupation of Iraq and its oil fields. The imperialists came in, slaughtered people en masse, destroying their homes, their infrastructure, and their lives. As money from the U.S. government began to flow into Iraq, it went entirely into building protection and comfort for the troops, propping up the local puppet government, and guarding the oil infrastructure. The oil was kept the most secure as it was the purpose of the entire war, just like arable land in the Hoover Dam was the purpose of the NCR invasion. In both cases, the occupation has manifested in the protection of the imperialist plunder, while ignoring the needs of the local population and brutalizing them. Similarities between the U.S. and the NCR exist in the justification for the invasion. The NCR, like the U.S. government, made claims of invading to civilize the people that live there. The U.S. is a bastion of freedom and democracy, and it must bring those same virtues to the people of Iraq and others. This is not unlike the white man's burden or the logic of the colonizer bringing civilization to the so-called savages. The NCR makes these kinds of claims too. They claim to be the bastion of hope and civilization in the wasteland. The NCR is the defender of freedom and democracy against the evils of the Kaiser. In truth, the NCR, like the U.S., cares nothing about freedom and democracy for the people they occupy. Some of those involved in the occupation of New Vegas and the surrounding areas recognize the brutal nature of its occupation. Some even see the futility in it. Chief Hanlon is one of those people. He is a war hero of the NCR who has seen better days. The course of the Mojave campaign has made its mark on him. The war against the Legion has left its toll on the men and women of the NCR Army, and along with his frustrations born from the New Vegas bleeding dry NCR soldiers, while at the same time relying on their protection, has left Hanlon fearing for the future of the NCR should they succeed against the Legion. The sheer scale of the Mojave Desert and the Colorado River being too much for an already overstretched NCR conscripted army to bear. This disillusion drives Hanlon to act with ill intention towards the NCR forces by falsifying intelligence reports and deliberately miscommunicating information sent in from various NCR outposts, ultimately seeking to stir unrest in the NCR forces stationed in the Mojave and hoping to start a resistance against the higher echelons of the NCR military. When speaking to Hanlon in depth, he reveals that he sees the war as being endless and that they will be carrying out an occupation forever. He foresees the NCR overstretching itself and covering the Colorado River the same way that the U.S. is overstretching itself trying to occupy the Middle East. Hanlon has grown tired of the occupation and thinks it is an unwinnable war. He doesn't think that the Mojave can be conquered and that the troops will forever have to be stationed there. This reflects quite accurately the opinions of many Afghan war veterans. They too realize that the war cannot be won. The Taliban will not be defeated by NATO forces, and this will require them to engage in a permanent military occupation if they are ever to keep control over the country, even with what little control they actually have. The reality of the attrition of war has struck Hanlon. With his decades of experience, he sees too many young people dying for the benefits of the higher-ups in the business. He's like some people in the military, too depressed to continue, too ingrained in the life to quit. In his opinion, the next battle for Hoover Dam is a folly that will be unsuccessful, meaning those who die in it will die for nothing. Despite many soldiers having a similar opinion about the war, they still have their fallback justification, the same one that imperialist soldiers have in real life. The job still needs to be done. Regardless of the suffering caused by the NCR, Kaiser's Legion still needs to be stopped, just as every burnt-out soldier who tells themselves that the terrorists must be stopped. Of course, the difference is that Caesar's Legion is a real threat, whereas the terrorists are not. The point is that the same justification exists in the mind of the imperialist soldiers who are questioning what they are doing. As the NCR occupies territory, we see a marked difference between them and Caesar's Legion. The NCR spends a good deal of effort in breaking up alliances of various tribes in order to weaken their ability to resist NCR occupation. The plan has been to create hostilities between various groups with a twofold effect. First, to make resistance against them weaker, and second, to make justifying their occupations easier by claiming they want to unify everybody under one republic. This requires only a little effort, and all they really have to do is sabotage the various groups. This shows that the NCR is really disconnected from the people of the Mojave. They don't understand them because they don't really want to help them. They only want to occupy. This is very similar to what the U.S. does when it invades. People know nothing of the culture and just brutalize them into submission. This is the most key aspect of the NCR being imperialists, colonizers, settlers. They only wish to remove the customs and the cultural dynamics to promote their own power and interests. By this same token, they also know when not to sabotage someone. They felt no need to do this to Mr. House, who they gladly enter into an alliance, even if a tentative one, with. Mr. House is a good example of the national bourgeois who ally with the imperialists in order to defend their privileged position in society. If the national bourgeois actually resist the imperialists, they could just take away all of their money and status via military force. On one hand, some of them are afraid of what Caesar's Legion might do to them. They know they can get a good deal with the NCR, but Caesar's Legion might just confiscate their wealth altogether. On the other hand, there are some merchants who want Caesar's Legion to take over because they feel they would do a better job of protecting the trading routes, making their business safer and more profitable. In this circumstance, there can develop a contradiction between the various interests of the capitalist class. This is something similar to what Mao Zedong described when he wrote about the various classes in society. The middle bourgeois. This class represents the capitalist relations of production in China in town and country. The middle bourgeois, which is meant chiefly by the national bourgeoisie, is inconsistent in its attitudes towards the Chinese Revolution. They feel the need for revolution and favor the revolutionary movement against imperialism and the warlords when they are smarting under the blows of foreign capital and the oppression of warlords. But they become suspicious of the revolution when they sense that, with the militant participation of the proletariat at home and the active support of international proletariat abroad, the revolution is threatening the hope of their class to attain the status of a big bourgeoisie. Politically, they stand for the establishment of a state under the rule of a single class, the national bourgeois. A self-styled true disciple of Tai Chao Dao wrote in Chenpao, Peking, "Raise your left fist to knock down the imperialists and your right to knock down the communists." These words depict the dilemma and anxiety of his class. It is against interpreting the Kuomintang's principle of the people's livelihood according to the theory of class struggle, and it opposes the Kuomintang's alliance with Russia and the admission of communists and left-wingers. But it's an attempt to establish a state under the rule of the national bourgeois. It is quite impractical, because the present situation is such that the two major forces, revolution and counter-revolution, are locked in a final struggle. Each has hoisted a huge banner. One is the red banner of the revolution, held aloft by the Third International as the rallying point for all the oppressed classes of the world. The other is the white banner of counter-revolution, held aloft by the League of Nations as the rallying point for all the counter-revolutionaries of the world. The intermediate classes are bound to disintegrate quickly, some sections turning left to join the revolution, others turning right to join the counter-revolution. There is no room for them to remain independent. Therefore, the idea cherished by China's middle bourgeois of an independent revolution in which it would play the primary role is a mere illusion. In their eyes, it is in their interest to align themselves with the imperialists, to retain what power they have in society, showing truly what a counter-revolutionary force they are. The Crimson Caravan Company can be seen as a foreign corporation, moving into the New Vegas area. This is a primary drive of imperialism. The foreign corporations have an advantageous position coming from the imperialist nation. Because of their advanced position, concentration of capital, and military support, they can set up in the new country quite easily. The Crimson Caravan has a tremendous amount of market power. They are able to make large purchases, reducing the cost per unit. This allows them to outcompete the local traders, snatching up their trade routes and customers. Essentially, the foreign bourgeois can muscle its way into the domestic bourgeois. A good example of this is cola in many countries. Coke has such a dominating global market share that when they move into a new country to compete, they can undercut all the local competitors. From this, we can see a small sample of how the bourgeois of the imperialist nations benefit from imperialism. We also see, as Lenin writes, why it pushes for it. The enormous dimensions of finance capital concentrated in a few hands and creating an extraordinary dense and wide network of relationships and connections which subordinates not only the small and medium, but also the very small capitalists and small masters. On the other hand, and the increasingly intense struggle waged against the other national state groups of financiers for the division of the world and the domination over other countries, on the other hand, caused the property class to go over entirely to the side of imperialism. General enthusiasm over the prospects of imperialism, furious defense of it, and painting it in the brightest colors. Such are the signs of the times. Imperialist ideology also penetrate the working class.